biggest personalities in the Torah. Thank you, Rabbi, for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. And I want to first apologize to Sunny. We don't know each other that well. We've met one time actually in person. And Toby emailed me, I think today, and said, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make it. And then I emailed her back and Sunny back saying, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to make it either. It's a game time decision. And then I get 10 minutes later, I get a carried call from Sunny. She actually called somebody here who rushed in here and saying, please, she needs to know so she can pick somebody else to do something today. And so I felt really bad. So I'm sorry about that.
No problem.
But it is a pleasure to be here with everybody. I'm going to feel guilty, but it's still pretty funny. It's a pleasure. What we're going to do today for a little while is just talk about the biggest small personalities. So some of them will be well known, others may not. You may have heard of a couple, some you may know a lot about, some you may not realize are little personalities because they're so famous. And I'm happy to do this another time. There's so many of them, so you can only choose so many. And we're going to go just with the Torah, but if you go outside the Torah to the Bible, there's a host of other ones that are really interesting. They have when I say biggest small personality, I'm talking about time, the amount of space they have in the Torah. So someone who does not have a lot to say in the Torah, I would say is kind of a small personality. The best example, one of them, or I would say, is like Eve. Now, Eve is a very famous woman, obviously, but she doesn't have a lot to say or do in the Torah. I mean, she's born, she has the issue with the snake, and they get kicked out, but there's not really a lot she does. But yet this small personality who doesn't have a lot of space, of course, has had a critical impact on our world, certainly in many ways more than most characters in the Bible, if you look at it from a certain perspective. So when you look at Adam and Eve, who is this Eve person? And it's really interesting to see that she has become, in many ways, until probably the last 40 years, kind of the stereotype of women overall. She has been the stereotype of women in terms of negative aspects of women. She is the deceiver, or from the other perspective, the person who is easily deceived. So she is both deceiver and ignorant. She's both clever, but in a negative way, and also very short-minded. This is a woman who has been used against women for a very long time, and it probably wasn't that way in the beginning. So if you've read Bruce Feiler's books, he talks about the change in culture that are epitomized in the scene in Genesis we find in the Garden of Eden. In ancient cultures, women and men were much more, what you could say, living in an equal society. This is when we're hunters and gatherers. While we're hunters and gatherers, a high percentage of the goddesses, of the gods or goddesses, and often very powerful ones, even more powerful than the men. And he says that starts to change about 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years ago, the moment that women started to become less than is when we went from hunter-gatherers to farmers. Once we're farmers and we have to work the land, suddenly things start to change. And this is the example that they are in paradise. And what happens when Adam and Eve leave paradise? What is the punishment for Adam? He has to farm the land. So the inference here from Bruce Feiler is that paradise is when they're hunters and gatherers and we're living in an equal society. But once Eve and Adam are kicked out of the garden and become farmers, that is when society starts to change. And it really changes as we go into cities and become city-states, really in the late 4th century, especially because if you're farming the land, you need to have more people who are strong. If you're farming the land, that means women have to spend more time being pregnant and have more children. And obviously they're going to die quicker because obviously mortality rates for infants and for women giving birth are very high back then. But then you have to look at when we become city states, that means you need to have armies to take control, and you need to have people who are going to be leaders. And so when this starts to happen, the number of goddesses starts to become less and less, and women become less and less equal partners in society. And this is one of the things that we see from the perspective of Eve. Eve is created in the image of man, but where does she come from? She comes from the body of Adam, at least in the second story. And yet we see there is some sense of equality between them originally, until she is deceived. So again, she is easily deceived by the serpent and then deceives Adam. And this is used as a way to limit women throughout the ages. Unfortunately, because there are a lot of ways to read this story, but that is one that is most often used. That Eve is the one who made the mistake and then convinced Adam to make the mistake. And throughout history, we see Eve again and again being used in this way. We see women being limited. One of the best parts to I forgot what was the last book he wrote, not the new one. I just forgot the name of it. Not the one he just wrote, not Council of Dads. Anyway, he went to the Sistine Chapel. He was given 15 minutes alone in the Sistine Chapel, which, as you can imagine, is probably a pretty big deal. And so he's in there and he's looking at the beautiful ceiling, and then he realizes that the first woman allowed in the Sistine Chapel is actually Eve, because women are not allowed there until I think the 16th century or 17th century, except he has this beautiful depiction of Eve. There are other women's there. That's the first woman there, but it's interesting that he was able, because he's Michelangelo, to get away with this where others were not. And it's really not to the modern era that we've really started to rethink the Eve character. And there are a lot of books out there, obviously today. Obviously the women's movement in the 70s had a lot to do with it, but there's been a lot of scholarship by women transforming Eve into what she probably originally was. And my favorite depiction of Eve, and of course I tell this all the time. I think many of you have heard of Mae West, a A-list movie star in the 20s and 30s, very voluptuous, known for that. And she depicted Eve, and still my favorite incarnation of Eve all time. She did a radio program with, what's his name from the Bickersons? He was also in Cocoon. I just forgot his name. Anyway, he plays Adam to her Eve. And Adam is kind of like this nebbish guy who's just kind of a follower. And what is Eve? Eve is like her own person. She is someone who feels that her personality is too small for the Garden of Eden. She needs to be out in the world with people, making mistakes, getting into trouble, doing things, being a human being. Whereas Adam is just kind of this stay at home, I'll do whatever you tell me kind of person. Don Amici, thank you, Adam. Don Amici. And so she does not accidentally deceive Adam, and she has never deceived herself. Why? She learns from the serpent what will happen if she eats from the tree. They use the apple in the radio show. It's probably more a date or a fig. She does it intentionally. She wants to eat it, and she wants Adam to do it because she wants to bring him out of his shell and see the world. And there has been a lot of scholarship in recent years on the fact that perhaps Adam and Eve were supposed to leave the garden, that the garden was too limiting, that the garden is a place for, animated Robotron human beings, not for free thinkers. That we don't deserve the Garden of Eden in that way. We have to find it ourselves. So in that perspective, which we see all over the place these days, many of us would not even know that Eve had been the negative, the stereotype of negative women qualities for millennium, because today Eve has a whole new narrative. But before recently, it would have been almost always a negative stereotype. At the very best, she was the voluptuous deceiver. At the worst, she was an idiot and used her feminine wiles to destroy humanity. But if you look at what Mae West did now, and I also like to mention that when Mae West did this radio program, afterwards she was banned from radio for the next 25 years because of the way she portrayed. She basically said, I have a big personality. I don't want to be in here anymore. I want to leave. And she was banned from the radio, which probably in actuality helped her career, because anytime you're banned from something, it probably makes you more popular. So it didn't hurt her career, but it's really interesting that that's who they chose to play Eve. And it was really an incredible program. I'm sure it's on, I have a copy of it, but I'm sure it's on YouTube or on other places. So she's the first big small personality. Like Miriam, who I don't know we're going to get to, Miriam, who is Moses' sister, we think of as a major character. She's got like 5 scenes, and she only talks in like 2 of them or 3 of them. And in 3 of the 3 scenes, she really says anything. 2 of them, she's rebelling against Moses. So the only time we see her in a positive light is really when she dances with the people after leaving Egypt and when she dies. But the next person I'm going to talk about is a ginormous personality, even though has a very small part, is only found in a few lines in Genesis 14. Genesis 14 is famous because it's the War of the 7 Kings. This is not a Tolkien, Lord of the Rings story, because that's the War of five armies. The War of 7 Kings. Abraham is a hero, a military hero in the story. His nephew is kidnapped during this war. He goes in and wins the war, and he brings back the spoils to the kings that had been sided with his nephew. And of course, he's not going to keep any spoils for him. He wants it for his men. And when he comes to be rewarded and serenaded by the 4 kings and their people that won the war, he meets a strange man. It comes out of nowhere. He's introduced, and he disappears so quickly. If you don't look, you're going to miss him. One of the later ones we're going to talk about is even more so, but his name is Melchizedek, or in Hebrew, Melchizedek. It's a very obvious name because it basically means priest of the kingdom, or king. It really literally means righteous king, but he's introduced as the priest of the God Most High. Now remember, he's not Jewish. At this time, the only monotheist on earth is Abraham and those living with him. Who knows if Lot is even a monotheist at this time? He is the only monotheist. And then at this celebration, this man just appears as the priest of the Most High, using the same language for God as is used for us throughout the Bible. And this man basically comes here and basically meets and praises Abraham, who's known as Abram at the time, for what he has done. And it's really incredible that, not that this man praises him and they break bread and do all of these things that are usually done, but he is referred to this. Now, Melchizedek, king of Salem. What does the word Salem or Salem sound like to you? Think of it as the second part of a word. They may not be allowed to talk, sorry. Jerusalem. Abraham meets somebody who is the king of Jerusalem, who is a priest of the God Most High, possibly referring to our God, although he's not Hebrew, and he is rewarding Abraham for his deeds. As you can imagine, this man is very prominent in another religion, Christianity, more so than in Judaism, because he could be referred to as Jesus, he could be referred to as an angel, he could be referred to as a whole host of things because of the references to him as being a priest of Most High, and because he is a righteous king, and because he is the king of Salem, which of course will be now. Now, historically, I don't believe there is a city in Jerusalem during the time period of Abraham. When David takes the city, it is already a city, and he then names it Jerusalem using a very similar wording to what it was called. I think it was called Jerusalem. He changed it to Jerusalem. So that is, I believe, the first time there's a city where it is today. But again, the fact that we have a man called Melchizedek, and I have a picture, he's depicted, of course, we don't have an actual picture of him because cameras were not invented for a couple of years after he was created. But here's a picture of him. Can you see him? There you go. So that's him exchanging food and drink with Abraham, or known as Abram at the time. It's not a great picture, but obviously he is depicted throughout. So he's known in English as Melchizedek. In Hebrew, it's pronounced a little differently. Obviously, there's no CH, but and with the cha. But it's an incredible experience to see that perhaps there were other people who believed in Elohim, in God, as we did, even if they weren't Jewish, or that the Torah is trying to tell us that there were perhaps others who shared similar beliefs. One way you could look at it is other people. Now, there's a lot of midrash on when God chose the Jewish people, he went to other peoples first, and they all said no. Maybe this is one of those people that the king said yes, but the rest of the people said no. Maybe he is some sort of angelic character. We don't know. It's just interesting that he's the king and he's a righteous king. He is also, I will add, doing something illegal in Judaism. He's actually doing something that is one of the worst things you can do according to the Bible. What is one of the worst things? Beyond like being a murderer or being someone who eats rye with mayonnaise on white. The worst thing you can be is what the Maccabees became. There is an automatic division in Judaism from the very beginning. The division is between the state and the church, between the secular and religious. There is always a leader of both, but never at the same time. Moses, is Moses the religious leader or the secular leader? He is the secular leader. Who is the religious leader? He gives that to his brother Aaron, or God does. Is King David a priest? The answer is no. If he were a priest, he would be forbidden to be the king. This gentleman is Melchizedek, which is righteous king, priest of Salem, or priest of the Most High. So he is a king priest. So again, something that would never have been allowed in Judaism is being shown here. We could go farther into that, talking about perhaps he is one of the reasons it was divided later. But again, it's a very interesting thing that all of the, and he leaves. We don't see him again. I mean, he's referred to, but we never see him in person again. We don't know who he is, where he came from. He comes and he is gone. He disappears. He's also got a really awesome name, Melchizedek. It's a beautiful name, so that's probably nice. Are there any questions so far about these two? I don't know if they're allowed to ask questions or unmute themselves. Any questions?
It's Carol. I have a couple
Hi,
of
Carol.
questions. Hello. In reference to the first part you were talking about, and actually in this also, is it possible that since we are a people of where time is not necessarily linear, I mean, historic time is linear, but when we're standing at Har Sinai, we are all standing at Har Sinai in all generations before and after. Is it possible in the stories that you've told that that the visitation, let's say, of somebody to one of our characters that we know more intimately, like Abraham, is it possible that the appearance of this person, Melchizedek, is a foretelling of some of the stories? I know that there is some thought that if you believe that the Bible is actually codified by human beings and inspired by God, as opposed to written by God, that that there might have been insertions in the story, and maybe the idea of a priest king gave some validity to characters that are later. But beyond that, is there a sense that the introduction of that type of spiritual being that is unexplained could be some foretelling of future events? And I'll
Well, and that's a
mute
great
myself.
question. I look at the Bible as being written over a period of 1,500 years or so. Some would believe that it's written by God. If you believe that, then actually you can't say that. But if you look at the way it's written, chapter 14, which is a war story, if you take out chapter 14, it changes nothing in the text. You can go from 12 to from 13. 13 goes before 14, right? Yeah. 13 to 15 straight, and you're not missing anything. So it's almost assuredly believed. I mean, it's probable that chapter 14 itself is an assertion. Why would you insert this? Well, again, this is from my belief system. As it's been edited over time, it's often important that if you were a warrior, that you have an ancestor who was a warrior, that you can say, my ancestor was Abraham. Abraham was a warrior. Look at this chapter 14. It shows that Abraham defeats 5 kings by himself. He has an army and he says, I'm going to take a few of you guys and we're just going to beat the army by ourselves. So that is possibly one of the reasons it is put here. However, within chapter 14, the section of Melchizedek is probably an insertion later into the insertion. Because if you take the story of Melchizedek out, it doesn't change chapter 14. It goes continuously. So it almost as surely has been put in there for some reason. Carol, what you said is very possibly true. There is a host of reasons that Melchizedek could be there. And it could be an assertion that if you want to be king, you need to be righteous to be given the idea of a king. It can be assertions for a variety of things. Abraham is very deferential to this man, so obviously he is an important character. There could be, very likely, if we lived 2,500 years ago or 3,000 years ago, we would all know the name Melchizedek. He could have been a very popular name we knew about. So popular that they didn't feel like they needed to write him anything else about him. It's like saying, in 2,000 years saying Michael Jordan was an incredible athlete. Automatically, we know Michael Jordan played what sports? Basketball. Even if you're not a basketball fan, you've heard of Michael Jordan. He's so obvious. Well, it may be that Melchizedek was so well known, you didn't really have to explain anything else about him. But
Michael Jordan's that well known because he went to North Carolina.
That's right. Because he went to North Carolina, that's the reason.
And not Duke.
So it's really, when you
I'm going to tell
Mike,
Joel on you.
when you say Michael Jordan, the first thing you think is North Carolina is awesome. I can't remember what sport Michael Jordan played, though. That's the first thing you think. So this is very possibly this character was well known, or he's also very possibly inserted into an insertion and there for a particular reason. And there's a lot of scholarship on it. But he's just an interesting guy because he seems to be a real nice guy, very well liked. And I think I have 45 minutes, right, Sonny? Is that it? All right, so we'll go through a couple more. And if there's any questions, let me know. The next one I'm going to talk about is probably the briefest appearance of any character in the Bible, certainly in the Torah. It's the character of someone we don't even know his name. So basically, Joseph, who we know is from the coat of many colors, is been asked by his father to go find his brothers, basically to spy on them, because his father does not trust his brothers for obvious reasons. We know what happens next. And he gets to Shechem, where they're supposed to be, but they're not there. And all of a sudden, a guy comes up out of nowhere, a certain man, you can translate it anywhere you want, found him as he's looking around the field. And basically says, what are you seeking? And Joseph says, I seek my brothers. Tell me, where are they feeding our flock? And he says, go to Dothan. And that's it. And that's the whole story. So we have a man who comes out of nowhere, no name. It's kind of like Clint Eastwood in the 60s, you know, cowboy movies, the man with no name. He doesn't know Joseph. He just sees a boy wandering. Joseph says, have you seen my brothers? He says, go to Dothan. He doesn't say what his name. Joseph never gives his name, never gives the name of his brothers. So who is this stranger who knew who Joseph was, even though Joseph didn't know him, who knew automatically who Joseph's family were and knew where to send Joseph? Now, the most obvious thought as to who he is, of course, is if you don't know who somebody is, he's often referred to as an angel or angelic creature. So he is very often, probably, I don't know if it's no frequently, I would say more often than frequently, referred to as an angel necessary for the story. What do we mean? The story of Joseph being sold into slavery, bringing the people to Egypt, cannot happen if he is not sold into slavery. So this man is sent there to make sure Joseph goes where he's supposed to go so that they will sell him to slavery instead of killing him, and so that we will have the story of the Exodus. So in other words, this no-name person is the domino, maybe. But Tina says he's a facilitator. Good point. But he is a necessary persona, but not necessary enough to give him a name. Obviously, when you think of famous angels, the more famous one, of course, is not this one, but the one with Jacob that he fights if it is an angel. This one, I think, is even more interesting because there's just nothing here. I mean, he basically just says, what are you doing? I'm looking for my brothers. Go to Dothan. And that's it. So we don't know where he comes from. We don't know how he knows this, but he continues the story. He ensures that the story continues because obviously if Joseph can't find his brothers in Shechem, he's probably going to go back to home to his dad. He's going to say they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And it's going to create more havoc, but not get him into Egypt. So most people don't even know he exists. You wouldn't even know he's there. He goes so quickly, but it's really interesting to see that you sometimes need these nondescript people to continue the story. Any thoughts or questions before we go on to the next one? And we're going through them pretty quickly. Okay, we're going to go to 145 and open up for questions. So, and I'm going to just go through pretty quickly. We're not going to delve too deeply into it. The next one I'm going to talk about is a small, big personality. I mean, a big, small personality, although she has a lot of time. She basically has one story to herself, and then we rarely hear about her again. And it's an essential story for a wide range of reasons. And I talk about it because it's a very important story after you've talked about the story of Eve. The story of Eve is one of empowerment, and that women start to lack it as time goes on. And by the time we get to the story of Tamar, a woman is in many ways defined by her husband and her children, as we know. If you don't have them, you're probably not going to be as respected, and you're probably having a lot of issues. It was very important for women to have children. So this is the story of Tamar. How many of you have ever heard of Tamar? It's a very popular name in Hebrew, as we can imagine. It's been put into English. Obviously, she is a very interesting character. This is a woman who is the epitome of using the limited resources she has to get what she needs or what is fair for her. So in a basic story, she is this daughter-in-law of Judah. Judah, of course, is one of the 12 brothers. He is going to end up being the head of the family. You might say, wait, Joseph's the head of the... Joseph is going to be the grand vizier of Egypt. When all the Jews move there, Judah is the head of the family. Joseph is doing his own thing. So it's kind of like if you're the eldest brother of your family, but your younger brother is president of the United States. You're the head of the family because he's off running the country. So Judah, who will become the head of the family, is a nefarious bloke beforehand. And he has 3 sons. He marries off his eldest son to Tamar. And Tamar is married to Er. He's not a guy, doesn't do anything. The son dies. And so we know what's the tradition. If the son dies and he hasn't had children with a woman, what happens to the woman? She marries the next one. And again, I don't know if they have the law of the chalitza then, because this predates Exodus. So she may have had no choice, or maybe she liked the next brother. Anyway, her first husband's wicked. She marries the next one, and he dies because he was wicked. And so now there's one young son. So she is basically legally automatically married to the third brother. And Judah says, we're going to wait till he gets older and then you can marry him and have kids. But Judah thinks that Tamar is cursed. And so he does not marry her, and he's not planning to officially marry her to her son. What is the problem for her? She is still legally married to him, even though she's not married, means she cannot have legitimate children now. And if she's caught trying to have children, she could be killed because she's committing adultery. She is in a state of purgatory for the rest of her life. And she is stuck, as so many women have been throughout history. And so she takes the only recourse that she thinks she has. After Judah's wife dies, he goes to wherever men go to find those kind of women to satisfy himself. The oldest profession in the world, although it's not, the oldest profession is actually farming. But he finds a harlot and he goes to bed with her, not realizing the harlot is Tamar, who veils herself, and he leaves his signet ring and his staff there. And after he comes back to the room to get it, she's gone. He has no idea who took his stuff. But months later, he finds out Tamar is pregnant, and he knows it wasn't from his son. So he goes to the authorities to capture her and have her killed. It's a tough world, obviously. But when this happens, she shows him his staff, the seal, also has his belt, and he realizes that guess who is the father? He's the father. I don't know what the legalities are of this, but it is a very difficult, you can imagine, moment for her, because she's done something illegal. But has she done something illegal? She has slept with an unmarried man of the family she's supposed to be part of. Is she legally married to the son or the father? I do not know. We do not have these rules listed at this time period. Here she is. Why do we see her this way? She's covering her face with the veil, so her father-in-law doesn't know who she is. So what in the end happens? And remember, up until this point, Judah is a nefarious guy. He is not known. He's the one who sells his brother into slavery. He's the leader of this. This is the moment where Judah changes. You think about it. When you're teaching Sunday school, for instance, you're teaching high school, and you've got 10 boys in the class, and these are the worst boys ever, always troublemakers. They're going to definitely go to jail. They're going to jail right after high school. And then you meet them later, and they're all doctors and lawyers and senators. This is Judah. Judah is a rough and tumble, beyond mischief maker. He's like a criminal. And this is the aha moment where he realizes the person he's become. And so those children claims as his own. And of course, one of them is Peretz, who will eventually be the ancestor of who? King David. So this alliance is given certification because King David comes from this line, just like who else? What other woman is famous for being part of this line? Ruth. Ruth marries Boaz, who is a descendant of Peretz. So two women who are very strong, using what they have in the world, influence Judaism to create King David. In other words, the Bible is actually way ahead of its time in depicting women, even though we really looked at it as behind our time, and we know we're not perfect either. But comparatively, it is ahead of its time, trying to show women, generally giving women at least moments of strength. Think of Sarah, think of Rebecca, think of Rachel. They all have to be a little sinister, Leah, in some ways. Why? Are they sinister women? No, it's because they have no other recourse. And so we see Tamar, and instead of her being punished or blamed or ridiculed throughout history as Eve is, she is venerated. And that's a pretty impressive thing, to be venerated in this way after she pretended to be a harlot. Think about that. A harlot, or a woman who pretends to sleep with her father-in-law, and yet she is venerated. And that says a lot about who she is and how important a role she plays. Now I'm going to go to two more women. We're not going to get to Miriam. She's pretty well known. These other two women, and we can go to others. I have a whole list of them if you think they're too well known. But you cannot talk about big, small personalities without talking about Shifra and Puah. I mean, they are essential. They're this much about them. It's one little section in the very beginning of Exodus. Who are Shifra and Puah? They are the midwives, the Egyptian midwives, who save the babies. In case you've forgotten the story, a new king arises over Egypt, and later he decides the Israelites are too numerous and says all baby boys are to be killed. Obviously, this Pharaoh didn't understand how it works in creating new life, that women are probably just as important, but all boys are to be killed. So these two midwives refuse to do it. And when he questions them, they say, you know, those slave women, they are so strong that they have babies so quickly, by the time we get there, they're already gone. And it's a nondescript moment. It's kind of almost sarcastic in many ways. It's almost like a joke, like me saying something to Sonny, and I apologize again, but it's not. It's a powerful moment for a couple of reasons. One, we do not know if they are Egyptian or Hebrews. The language in Hebrew does not, basically says they are deliverers of Hebrew babies, but we don't know if they're Hebrew themselves. So they could be slaves or they could be Egyptians. Most likely, I would say a lot of people, they're Egyptians, because obviously they're able to talk to Pharaoh in a way. Now, if they are Egyptians, think about what they did. And we don't, and they're actually, they're not killed or anything later. It says that they go on to live, you know, very, very happy lives. They stand up to Pharaoh, who is not only king, but a God king. And they lie to a God king who may have control of their lives here and in the next world, for all they know, to save slave babies. That is a pretty incredible step to be taken by these women. Even more so, if they're slaves, he would just kill them probably, but they, you know, I don't know, he maybe God influenced him so he would believe what they were saying. We don't know. We do know that these women are incredibly brave, and save a lot of babies. They could be representative of all the midwives. Obviously, if there's a lot of babies being born, there's going to be more than two. Or it could be that there just wasn't many babies being born at this particular time and they only needed two. It's hard to tell. But Shiphrah and Puah have a very small little section about them, and they are, again, venerated in Judaism, whether you think they're Hebrew midwives or Egyptian midwives. And again, when you say they're a Hebrew midwives, it could mean they are Hebrews who are midwives, or it could mean they are midwives to Hebrews. Can you see that? Even in English, you can see why it doesn't work. I mean, it's not specific. In Hebrew, it's the exact same thing. So, and remember, when they talk to him, Pharaoh is really upset. I mean, it basically says he is fuming, and yet they are able to do this. And I think it's, again, really indicative of women who are using what they have. The fact that they're midwives gives them some power in this area. And here is some, here's a picture of them. So you can see them right here, how they're depicted. On the left one, you see they're depicted as Egyptians. On the right one, it's hard to tell because they're depicted more as angelic forms, you know, because they're such good human beings. Any thoughts? All right, we'll just touch on Miriam a little bit since we have about 3 minutes. Miriam.
Rabbi, just
Sure.
quickly. So a lot of the things I've read have made the suggestion that Shiphrah and Puah actually were Miriam and Yocheved, and that Miriam was tasked with watching, Moses also, and that they were well known as Hebrew midwives. And when Batya, the Pharaoh's daughter, came and took Moses out, she knew to call for them to come and be nursemaids to baby Moses.
Yeah, and there is midrash especially on that. In fact, one of the pictures I showed you is based upon that midrash itself, that some would believe they were Shiphrah and Puah. Obviously, there's precedent because throughout history, Hebrew slaves or Israelites would have a different name. You know, like Esther had a different name. Joseph had a different name for their life outside. Joseph had a name for Egyptians. He had a name for, there's nothing that refers to that in the Bible, but there is a lot of midrash that says, that speculates. So you can't say it's wrong or right according to the Bible, but throughout history, they are often referred to this. Now, when it comes to Miriam, and we'll finish here, Miriam is probably the most interesting of all these characters because she has become so influential and so popular in modern culture, especially in the Jewish world. We got music based upon her with Debbie Friedman. We have Miriam's cup, of course, for the Seder. She has basically become the representative of women's rights in the Jewish world, somewhat, I imagine, also in the non-Jewish world. She is major. She's huge, much bigger than the others, although Eve is probably known more because of the connotations as the kind of where the charmer and the deceiver. Miriam has almost no say in anything about her. I mean, she really is almost never shown. There's only 5 moments she's even referred to. Is she the daughter who takes the baby in the river? Does anybody know, is that her? The answer is, we don't know, because the little girl who takes her brother along the river is never given a name. So we don't even know if that is Miriam or another sister. We know it's an older sister of Moses. We don't even know if Miriam's an older sister. We infer that because some say Miriam is that girl who took Moses, but we really don't know. We don't know if Aaron, we don't even hear mention of Aaron until much later. We don't hear it until the Exodus story with them leaving. So Miriam is really first mentioned when they get to the other side of the sea, and she starts dancing That is the highlight of her career. It is now thought, and it was for a long time, that she is kind of the spiritual head of the group, giving kind of the mother of the Israelites. We don't have evidence of this, but we do have evidence that she feels free talking to her brother because she rebels against him twice, basically. Once she and Aaron are upset because they feel like they're as connected to God as Moses, they should have that kind of same power. And another time, they're not happy with who Moses marries, and so they rebel against him, and then she ends up getting leprosy for a little bit. And then, of course, she dies. So she is not really mentioned very often, and she rarely speaks. And so in many respects, she is the biggest small personality because there is a feeling that she has a similar amount of airtime to Moses and Aaron, and she doesn't. She really doesn't. And so she, for some reason, and we can understand why, in the modern world has really taken on a new life. And she, like Hamilton, has made a huge comeback in recent years. And so that's what Miriam is. And of course, she is very famous for us. And okay, so now it's 1:47. Any questions, by the way? Or did I answer every one of them? Yep, check that off. Answered them all correctly. Tina, do you have a question?
Rabbi, I put a question in the chat.
Oh, sorry. Let's see what the question is. Now, exactly. And I just did a class previously. In many respects, she could be.
Excuse me, I only sent it to you so no one else saw it.
She could be the impetus for Mary Magdalene. And that is discussed quite a bit. And there's distinct possibility, actually Rose that in another class, that she is a harlot who becomes the Jewish form of sainted. And the same thing happens to Mary Magdalene. I don't know the Mary Magdalene story very well, but this is definitely one of the places. She's the most famous harlot from that perspective, even though she's not really. She acts as one for one moment, but she does not make a living doing this. Very astute. Anyone else have any questions? And I'm just rocking. Yes.
Rabbi, do you have a favorite minor character that you just feel like that everybody should pay attention to?
Well, I think these would be the list of them. I really like the the witch of Endor. You know, I'm very into, that is not she's not in the Torah, but she plays a really interesting role that has really superfluous in many ways. She is, of course, after Samuel dies, Saul is king, his kingship is failing, and he wants to talk to Samuel, who has died. So he finds a witch. And whenever I say that, I always think of Monty Python. She's a witch. The irony about it is Saul has forbidden witchcraft. So quickly she fears for her life. And he says, no, I'm not going to kill you. I just want to talk to Samuel. So she uses her power to bring Samuel back from the dead. And what does Samuel say? What are the wise words of wisdom that Samuel says to Saul, who had been his, in many ways, disciple? The wise words of wisdom were basically, why did you wake me? I'm resting. Don't bother me. It's like, why'd you wake me up? I already told you you're doomed. Why are you calling on me? And then that's it. So he is a witch who is just out of nowhere, has the power to bring back the dead, which presents a host of issues for sages throughout the generations, as you can imagine. How can this non-Jewish woman bring back the dead, which is a very impressive power, to say the least. We've seen it from Harry Potter. So there is a lot of explanation that has to be done to figure out what she did. Did she actually do this? Did God do it? Was she more of a snake charmer, that she was just deceiving him and had somebody pretending to be Saul? And so you have all this attempts to explain what and some rabbis will say, listen, she had this power, it happened, no big deal. Others would say, no, she couldn't have this power, it was done this way. So it's really interesting to have the Witch of Endor. Also, Endor is one of the planets in, of course, the Star Wars saga. So that just adds to it. Any other thoughts? All right. How do we do?
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi, for joining us today.
Thank you, guys. Again, it's great to see. I look forward to seeing you guys in person soon. And stay
Next
safe,
week.
everyone.
Next week, we'll have Molly Liberman talk to us about Loop It Up.
And she's awesome. She's great.
Yay. Well, bye, everybody.